Richard Fuld. You probably don't know his name, but you certainly felt his pain, or more to the point, the pain he created. You see, Fuld was the boss of Lehman Brothers Investment Bank, which was on Wall Street in the years leading up to its bankruptcy. That bank's demise kicked the world into a global financial crisis. Now, we might be feeling a bit sorry for Mr. Fuld. After all, imagine the shame of leading a 158-year-old company into bankruptcy. But I think we can save our tears. You see, Mr. Fuld was paid a staggering $466 million for his years as CEO. Now, that's not a bad reward for failure, don't you think? And he's not alone. Back in 2008, the very year the audacious Wall Street dishonesty created the crisis, those very same Wall Street bankers, they voted themselves $28 billion just in bonuses. We've become so used to those at the top using their power to skim off enormous unmerited paydays, we're almost numb. Meanwhile, 2.8 billion people, close to half of the world, struggle to get by on less than $2 per day. The chasm between the have-nots and the have-yots, it's getting bigger all the time. Something's gone wrong somewhere, hasn't it? This week on Masterstroke, we'll explore the history of art to see what it can teach us about the rights and the wrongs of money. Simply can't tell the story of art without exploring the complex intersection of religion, money, and art. During the Renaissance, the family with the biggest impact on the wealth of the world was the Medici family. They were so influential, they even forced their way into having 3 Medici popes. During the reign of these popes, money-making and religion became so intertwined they were inseparable. In fact, some scholars believe that the Crusades against the Muslims were primarily money-making endeavours, covered up by religious rhetoric. History indicates that the Medicis were more gangsters than bankers, but no one dared to touch them. They were simply too powerful. Here is a painting called The Adoration of the Magi. It depicts the men from the East coming to pay tribute to the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus. The trouble is this: when you take a look at the so-called 3 wise men, all 3 of them are Medicis. We have Cosimo here, who's kneeling before Mary, while his sons Piero and Giovanni, well, they feature here in the foreground. The head of the Bankers Guild commissioned Sandro Botticelli to paint this to demonstrate how close the Medicis were to divinity. It's no wonder some art historians have suggested that this painting be changed from the adoration of the Magi to the adoration of the Medici. Money, art, and religion. It all collided in the Medici legacy. But their ideas of money and the Bible's teachings could not be more at odds. So what does the Bible say about money? Well, quite a lot, actually. Money is mentioned over 800 times in the Bible. And the Bible's teaching on money is beautifully explored in some of the greatest art in history. Maybe Wall Street bankers should spend less time cooking up financial schemes and more time in art galleries. This painting here is called The Banker and His Wife. I remember when I first saw this painting in the Louvre, it just drew me in to take a closer look. The artist is Quentin Matsys. Now, Matsys was a deeply religious man. Not only did he create art that reflected complex spiritual concepts, he and his family knew what it was like to suffer for their faith. In the year 1543, Quentin's sister and brother-in-law were found reading the Bible. That was a shocking crime to the church of the day. The result? The brother-in-law was decapitated in the Laverne Square, while Catherine was buried alive right in front of the main cathedral. Maybe the immense sacrifice his family paid for their faith was on Quentin's mind when he painted this work. At first glance, it's a simple painting of a banker and his wife counting their money and weighing their gold. But there's much more to the scene that meets the eye. The reason bankers weighed gold is because money in the 16th century was determined by weight. Some scoundrels would shave off bits of gold every time they got a coin, and then they would put all the shavings together and melt them into a bar of gold. So if you weighed the gold, you knew exactly how much money you really had. But there are some other things in front of the banker. Here you can see an open silk purse filled with pearls. There's also a line of precious rings on a roll of paper. Right at the front of the bench is a mirror, and you can just see there the reflection of the window with a man looking through the window at the money being counted inside. The face of the banker has been painted to represent a successful, cautious businessman. You can just see that look in his eyes. Now let's come to the man's wife. Mrs. Banker is reading something. Can you see that? This lady is reading a religious book. In fact, it's an illustrated book of prayers. As she's doing her devotionals, she's distracted by the counting of the money. So she moves her attention from worshipping God onto that money. Here's the point of the painting. If there's one thing that destroys a love for God, it's the love for money. In fact, one art historian believes the man in the mirror, he was included to represent the fact that the banker and his wife are so blinded by their greed, they don't even realise there is danger right there at the window. When I first left school, I had one primary aim in my mind. You know what it was? To make money and plenty of it. I thought that if I could be a multi-millionaire by the time I was 30, then I'd be happy. But guess what happened? Instead of being a multi-millionaire by the time I was 30, I became converted, and that changed all my priorities. In fact, according to Jesus, you simply can't love God and money. He said this, "No servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." Many people who become rich are like the banker and his wife. They have all their money, but they lose sight of God. Now, let me say, there's nothing innately wrong with being wealthy. Some of the great men and women of the Bible, they had plenty of money. I think of Abraham, Job, Solomon, and David. The problem is not with the money. It's when we put our trust in our cash instead of trust in our God. And there's another, less obvious message in that painting. Some years after it was painted, someone wrote a Bible text around the frame of the painting, which said this, "Just balances and just weights shall ye have." It was God's instruction to his people saying, don't rip people off. Be just, be fair, be honest in all your dealings with money. The command to be financially honest is powerfully explored in this piece by El Greco. The title is Christ Driving the Traders from the Temple. El Greco is an interesting character. His real name is Dominikos Theotokopoulos. It's no wonder the Spanish shortened his name to El Greco, which simply means the Greek. He was born in Crete, but he came to prominence when he moved to Toledo in Spain. He hoped to make it as an artist in Madrid, but King Philip of Spain, he didn't like his work. And many of El Greco's contemporaries, well, they agreed with King Philip. His figures and colours were highly unorthodox. In fact, it wasn't until the 20th century that El Greco really came to prominence, over 300 years after his death. And today he's seen as a very early harbinger of Expressionism and Cubism. Interestingly, El Greco painted this scene of Jesus clearing the temple multiple times. But this version is what fascinated me while I was studying in the National Gallery of London, where it's housed. It breaks all the moulds. Note how the figures are elongated and the expressions were designed to communicate real human emotion. Also note the lack of detail. You see, he doesn't want the viewer to be distracted by magnificent architecture, detailed animals, or people in the background. He's painted the scene just as we view action. We focus on the primary actor, Jesus, as he rushes at us with a whip. In the swirl of the moment, there's action everywhere. It's exciting, it's terrifying, and we're drawn directly to Christ's eye. The point? We're seeing this action from his perspective. Why is Christ turning over the tables and clearing out the traders? Well, we don't have to guess. Christ is incensed because he's come to the temple and he's found commerce is taking place in the courtyard. As he says in the Bible, the temple is supposed to be a house of prayer, but these businessmen have turned it into a den of thieves. In fact, if you look closely, you can see that this painting, it's divided into two. El Greco has placed all the money traders on the left, and we can see in the background there's an image of Adam and Eve being expelled from the garden. It's a symbol of what's happening right there in the temple. On the other side are the apostles, and above them is an image of Abraham about to sacrifice Isaac. This represents the true church and the sacrifice that Christ, who is right in the heart of this painting, would soon experience on behalf of mankind. So what is it that these money traders were doing? One commentator explains that there were two forms of fraud taking place. As Jews came to the temple from all over the known world, they had to change money in order to purchase animals to sacrifice. Some sharp financiers were at the temple to change money. And of course, they cheated people with unfair exchange rates. It reminds me a bit of changing money at the airport today. Traders were also overcharging for animals to sacrifice. Now, many of the people coming to the temple were poor. They believed it was their religious duty to sacrifice animals. And these scoundrels exploited the religious devotion of the poor for their own profit. It's no wonder Christ was upset. And this dishonesty, it all occurred in the name of religion. It's a very stark reminder to all of us, whether we work on Wall Street or in the church, that God does not tolerate financial dishonesty. I've met many people during my business career who are involved in shady and dishonest practices. When I was working in advertising, my boss came to me and said, "Look, Neil, if you get into trouble, just lie." Well, I won't lie, or cheat, or shave off a bit here, or add a bit there. I genuinely believe what the Bible says, and that means that honesty is always the best policy. And in this painting, El Greco makes it perfectly clear how offensive dishonesty is to God. One of the most interesting things about money is what it can't buy you. In their early Liverpool days, the Beatles sang, "Money can't buy me love." Later in life, John Lennon sang about his idea of utopia. It included this: "Imagine no possession. I wonder if you can." But here's the odd thing. For a man who dreamed of a world with no possession, Lennon worked awfully hard to acquire them. In fact, the New York Times called Lennon, quote, "an enterprising real estate collector." One spectacular property wasn't enough for Lennon. He wanted more, and then more, and then more again, which I suppose isn't that surprising. It's part of human nature to want more stuff. And in this age of people living long lives, who among us hasn't counted up all our assets to see how we're positioned? I guess we all look forward to a good retirement. At least we want enough money to cover our hospital bills. Now, of course, intellectually, we know that, as the Beatles sang, money can't buy us love. And there's another thing it can't buy us: life. In Lennon's case, tragically, one lunatic with one bullet was all it took to take his life. And no amount of money, real estate, intellectual property rights, or investments meant anything at all to Lennon the second after that bullet tragically ripped through him. Here's a painting which explores this paradoxical relationship between wealth and life. It's by another artist with a remarkably complex name, Rembrandt Harmenzoon van Rijn. Imagine having to write that every day. Fortunately, we know him simply as Rembrandt. The subject of this painting is an old man in his study. He's examining one of his gold coins by candlelight. On its face, it's nothing other than a beautifully executed character study. But as with so much great art, there's far more to the story. This piece is entitled "The Rich Fool." Now, this is a reference to a parable by Jesus, which is found in the book of Luke. There, Jesus tells of a very wealthy man who accounts for all his assets. Basically, he set himself up for life. Then the man says to himself, "Great, now I can take it easy. I've got it made. It's all good times ahead." Now, for most of us, when we see a successful man or woman at the apex of their careers, we don't think they're fools. Quite the opposite. We see them as wise, hard-working, prudent people who've set themselves up for retirement very nicely. But Jesus said this man is a fool. Why? Because he doesn't know that on the very night that he wallows in success, he'll die. And then he'll have to give an account to God of what he did with the wealth that God gave him. The point of this story is twofold. Firstly, don't put your trust in money. Yes, it can get you stuff, but there's a limit to the usefulness of that stuff. Put your trust in someone eternal, God. Interestingly, if you look at the manuscripts in this man's library, you can see that they are written in Hebrew. Possibly that's a reference to religious texts. The man isn't focused on those texts. However, they sit lifeless while his eyes are fixed on the gold. But in a few hours, his life will be gone, and then all that gold in the world will be utterly meaningless. But the message in those Hebrew texts, they have eternal value. That's where his focus should be. Notice how the room in this painting is illuminated by a candle. Now, Jesus said that he was the light of the world. Maybe Rembrandt was trying to communicate that all the material blessings the man has are a gift from God. He can only enjoy them in this limited world, which is symbolized by the dark room, because God shines his light on the rich man. But instead of focusing on the light that comes from God, the rich man focuses on the gold, whose sheen is only a byproduct of that light. In the parable, the rich man refers to himself in the first person 6 times. I will do this. I will do that. I think this. I say that. It's all about me, me, me. And so Rembrandt paints him all alone. It's his last night on earth, but there's no wife around, no children, no friends, no neighbours, no colleagues, no one he's helping out, no one at all, just the man and his little gold coin. What a sad, cold, isolated life. By focusing all on himself, he's robbed himself of the most precious thing in life, to love and be loved. Jesus concludes his parable noting that the fool, quote, lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. The point? God doesn't bless us with material wealth in order for us to heap ever more decadent luxuries on ourselves. We're blessed for a reason, and that's to bless others. In Matthew 25, Jesus describes God's judgment of humanity in very confronting terms. He states that those who are welcomed into heaven are those who have been generous to those in need, who have fed the poor, clothed the naked, cared for the fatherless, housed the homeless. The Bible also tells believers to return 1/10 of all their increase to the work of faith. The rich fool, Jesus implies, hasn't done that either. Rembrandt's message in this piece: be faithful with your money. Of course, Jesus didn't just address giving by the super wealthy. Maybe one of his most poignant stories involved an elderly widow. When the offering plate went around, the rich man put in, well, let's say $100. When the offering basket came to this old widow, do you know how much she put in? Well, probably about 10 cents. And yet Jesus basically said to her, wow, did you see that? Look how much that lady has put in. Fantastic. Thank you. Why did he say that? He put it this way: they all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on. They gave from their wealth, but she gave from her poverty. You see, when it comes to giving, it's not what you give that counts. It's what you have left over that matters. My grandfather used to say to me, Neil, tithe is a test of your honesty, while offerings are a test of your generosity. This woman gave everything she had. Now, of course, Jesus doesn't ask us to do anything he didn't do himself. Paul describes the life of Jesus in this way: for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich. We think we've done something quite special if we give a homeless person $1 or $2. And when we give $100 to anything, maybe we're heroes. And in a small way, of course, that's true. After all, if everyone stopped giving to support the wonderful work our faith and charitable organisations do, society would be in a mess. But Jesus didn't just give a little spare change. He left the magnificence of heaven to be born in a stable. He grew up poor. He then roamed homeless. He gave everything he had to others. And even then, he wasn't done giving, because then he gave his own life. If we want a true picture of what sacrificial giving looks like, we just need to look at the life of Jesus. Now, here's the question. Does God need our money? No, God doesn't need our money. He owns the whole world. But God desires our heart. Jesus puts it this way, where your treasure is, that's where your heart will be too. If our treasure is in a little bit of shiny metal, like the banker and his wife, that's where our heart is. If we love money so much that we're willing to cheat people, like the traders in the temple, that's where our heart is. Or if we put our trust in our money, like the foolish rich man, that's where our heart is. But if our treasure is in providing food to the hungry, housing to the homeless, healthcare and education to the least fortunate, and the message of the gospel to the spiritually hungry, then our heart will be with God, because that's where his heart is. We began by asking what's gone wrong in our world's financial system. Why do those at the top skim unfairly? And why are those at the bottom exploited? I think the answer, at least in part, is that we've forgotten the great financial lessons explored in the art today. Life is about a lot more than cutting every corner in order to accumulate as much wealth as we can to use for our own selfish desires. In fact, Jesus tells us it's exactly the opposite. Life is about using the talents and assets God's loaned to us for our short time on earth to bless others. If our world can discover this essential masterstroke of truth, what a remarkably better life everyone would have, both the rich, the poor, and all of us in between.